In this episode, we're going to make the phrase continuous risk assessment feel less like a fancy corporate slogan and more like a normal habit that keeps a privacy program from drifting off course. A lot of beginners think risk assessments are single events, like you do one big review, write a report, and then you are done for the year. In privacy program work, that approach breaks down quickly because systems change, people change, vendors change, and business goals change, sometimes quietly and sometimes all at once. Continuous risk assessment is the idea that you keep checking the privacy risk picture as the organization evolves, so you can catch problems early and steer decisions before harm happens. It is not constant panic, and it is not constant paperwork, and it is definitely not trying to predict every possible bad thing that could occur. Instead, it is a steady cycle of noticing changes, asking the right questions, recording what you learn, and adjusting controls so that the program stays aligned with real operations. By the end, you should be able to explain what continuous risk assessment is, why it matters, and how it runs across systems, processes, and business activities in a practical way. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CIPM in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To understand continuous assessment, it helps to clarify what risk means in a privacy program, because privacy risk is not just about hackers or data breaches. Privacy risk is the possibility that personal data will be used, shared, stored, or handled in ways that create harm, violate expectations, or break legal obligations. Harm can be obvious, like identity theft, but it can also be quieter, like unfair outcomes, loss of control, or embarrassment, especially when data is sensitive. Expectations matter because people often feel harmed even when a company thinks it followed a rule, and those feelings can lead to complaints, loss of trust, and regulatory attention. Legal obligations matter because privacy laws often require certain safeguards, deadlines, and documentation, and missing them can create consequences even if no one was harmed directly. Continuous risk assessment keeps all of these dimensions in view, rather than treating privacy as a checklist. It also helps a program balance competing pressures, because businesses want to move fast while privacy programs want to move responsibly. When you treat risk assessment as continuous, you are basically saying the program will keep learning as the environment changes. A key concept here is that risk changes when things change, and things change more often than beginners expect. Systems change when software is updated, new features are added, or data storage moves to new places. Processes change when teams reorganize, new roles are created, or a business unit starts doing a task in a different way. Business activities change when new products launch, new markets open, new partners are added, or a company starts using data for new kinds of analysis. Even when no one announces a major change, small shifts can accumulate, like adding a new data field to a form, expanding a customer support workflow, or allowing a vendor to subcontract a task. Each of these shifts can alter what data is collected, who can access it, how long it is kept, and how it is shared. Continuous assessment is the practice of treating these changes as triggers for questions, not as background noise. When you do that, the privacy program becomes part of the organization's steering, not a separate compliance layer that reacts late. It also helps to separate the idea of a one-time assessment from a continuous assessment by thinking in terms of snapshots versus monitoring. A snapshot assessment is like taking one picture of a system and saying, "This is what we saw on this date." Snapshots are useful, especially for documenting a baseline, but they can become outdated quickly. Continuous assessment is more like having a routine that checks whether the picture is still accurate, and if not, what changed and whether the change matters. That routine can include regular reviews, periodic sampling, and event-based checks triggered by change. The continuous part is not that you are always assessing every system, but that you have a dependable mechanism to notice changes and evaluate them. This is important for beginners because it removes the impossible expectation that you must constantly analyze everything. Instead, you build a cadence and a trigger system that helps you focus on what matters most. Continuous assessment is a strategy for attention, not a strategy for exhaustion. To run continuous assessments across systems, you first need a practical map of where personal data lives and how it moves, because you cannot assess what you cannot locate. You do not need perfect detail to begin, but you do need enough understanding to identify the major systems that collect, store, process, or share personal data. For example, there are often systems for customer accounts, marketing, support, billing, analytics, and human resources, and each of those can have very different risk profiles. Some systems hold sensitive data, some are shared widely across teams, and some are tightly controlled. A system-based risk view looks at things like what data types are present, who has access, what security protections exist, what retention rules apply, and which vendors have involvement. Over time, your map gets better, but the key is to treat it as living information, not a document you write once and forget. Continuous assessment relies on keeping that map current enough to support real decisions. When the map is current, you can quickly ask, if this system changes, what privacy risks might change too? Running continuous assessments across processes means paying attention to how work actually happens, not just how policy says it should happen. A process might be how rights requests are handled, how marketing campaigns are approved, how new vendors are on board, or how employees request access to data. Processes have steps, roles, and handoffs, and risk often hides in the gaps between steps, like when responsibility is unclear or when documentation is inconsistent. A process-based risk view looks at whether the process produces predictable, accountable outcomes, especially when things get busy or unusual cases appear. For example, a rights request process might work fine for simple requests, but fail when the request involves multiple systems or requires identity verification across channels. A vendor onboarding process might look solid on paper, but break down when a team rushes to sign a contract. Continuous assessment of processes often involves checking for exceptions, delays, rework, and recurring confusion, because those are signs that a process is under strain. When you treat process health as a risk signal, you can improve outcomes by improving how work flows, not just by writing stronger rules. Business activities are the third part, and they are often the hardest for beginners to grasp because they sound broad and vague. A business activity is something the organization does with purpose, like launching a new product, expanding to a new country, partnering with another company, or using data for a new kind of decision-making. These activities can introduce privacy risk because they change context, and privacy is highly sensitive to context. Collecting an email address to send a receipt feels different from collecting an email address to build marketing profiles, even if the data element is the same. Continuous assessment of business activities focuses on changes in purpose, audience, and expectations, because those can change obligations and risk even if the technical system stays the same. For example, moving into a new market can change legal requirements and cultural expectations about privacy notices and consent. Adding a new partner can change data sharing patterns and create new onward transfer risks. When you keep business activities in view, you prevent the privacy program from becoming overly technical and missing the bigger picture. A practical continuous risk approach uses two kinds of triggers: time-based triggers and change-based triggers. Time-based triggers are regular reviews that happen on a schedule, such as checking key systems quarterly, reviewing vendor performance periodically, or revisiting risk registers on a monthly cadence. Change-based triggers happen when something meaningful changes, such as a new feature launch, a new data category being collected, a new vendor being added, or a process being redesigned. The reason you need both is that not all change is announced, and not all risk grows quickly. Time-based reviews catch slow drift, like gradual expansion of access or accumulation of stale data. Change-based triggers catch fast-moving risk, like a rapid product shift or a new integration that starts sharing data in new ways. The best continuous programs also learn from history, meaning they add triggers where problems happened before. If a certain type of change has caused issues in the past, you make it a standard trigger going forward. This way, the assessment program becomes smarter over time rather than repeating the same surprises. Risk assessment also needs a consistent way to describe and compare risks, because otherwise every assessment feels like a new argument about what matters. You can think of risk in simple terms as likelihood and impact, even without complex math. Likelihood is how probable it is that something will go wrong, and impact is how severe the harm or consequence would be if it does. Privacy impact can include harm to individuals, harm to trust, harm to business operations, and legal consequences, and different organizations weigh these differently. A continuous program benefits from having shared definitions, like what counts as high impact versus medium impact, and what kinds of controls reduce likelihood versus reduce impact. You also need a habit of documenting assumptions, like why you think a risk is likely or unlikely, because assumptions are often where disagreements hide. When you document assumptions, future reviews can check whether they were correct, which improves learning. This consistency is what makes continuous assessment feel like a coherent program rather than a set of unrelated opinions. Because privacy risk is connected to controls, continuous assessment should always ask not just what the risks are, but whether the controls still fit the reality of the situation. Controls can weaken over time, not because they stop existing, but because the environment changes around them. For example, a control that limits access might become less effective if new teams are added rapidly and access reviews fall behind. A retention control might become less effective if new storage locations appear and are not included in deletion routines. A vendor control might become less effective if a contractor adds subprocessors without clear disclosure or if the service expands beyond the original scope. Continuous assessment is where you notice these mismatches and decide whether to strengthen a control, redesign it, or add a new one. This is also where you watch for compensating controls, meaning if one control is weak, you might rely more on another until the weakness is fixed. The point is that controls are not static, and risk assessment helps keep them aligned with real-world operations. A major benefit of continuous assessment is that it helps you prioritize, because not everything deserves the same level of attention. Beginners sometimes think privacy programs should treat every issue as equally urgent, but that is a recipe for burnout and shallow work. Prioritization means focusing on the places where personal data sensitivity is higher, volume is higher, access is broader, change is frequent, and impact could be severe. It also means focusing on the places where the organization's objectives push hard, like rapid growth, new markets, or new data-driven features. Continuous assessment supports prioritization by giving you updated information, not guesses from last year. It also supports prioritization by showing where controls are stable and working, so you can spend less time there and more time where drift is happening. This is how a privacy program stays sustainable, because you do not need infinite resources to manage risk well. You need a disciplined way to focus resources on what matters most. Continuous assessment also has a human side, because it depends on communication and trust across teams. If teams believe assessments are just obstacles, they will hide changes or delay involvement, and risk will grow quietly. If teams believe assessments help them avoid rework and prevent disasters, they will bring changes forward earlier. That trust is built when assessments are consistent, fair, and focused on making decisions, not on punishing people. It also helps when the program communicates in plain language and explains why certain questions matter, especially to beginners and non-specialists. For example, rather than saying a data flow is non-compliant, you might explain that the organization needs to know who receives the data and why, so it can honor obligations and respond to requests. Continuous assessment becomes part of normal business when it feels like a shared safety practice. When it becomes normal, it also becomes faster because people know what information to provide and what kinds of changes trigger review. As you bring all of this together, you can picture continuous risk assessment as a living loop that touches systems, processes, and business activities, and keeps the privacy program honest about reality. Systems-based checks help you track where data lives, who touches it, and how technical changes affect risk. Process-based checks help you see whether work flows reliably, whether exceptions are rising, and whether outcomes are consistent. Business activity checks help you see when purpose, context, and expectations shift, even if the technical system looks unchanged. The loop is powered by triggers, supported by consistent risk language, and tied to control adjustments so the program actually improves. When this loop is healthy, it reduces surprises, lowers emergency fire drills, and makes it easier to explain privacy decisions to leaders and partners. It also turns the privacy program into something that can adapt, which is critical because change is a constant. For a beginner, the main takeaway is that continuous assessment is not more work for the sake of work. It is smarter work that keeps privacy aligned with how the organization really operates.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.